Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. What if I told you Japan's World War II Navy, one of the most disciplined forces in history, had its own hidden world of forbidden bonds? Life aboard those warships meant months at sea, isolation, and silence. Letters home were censored, emotions were buried. Yet behind the drills and the slogans of honor, there are fragments, diaries, court records, quiet testimonies that hint at relationships between sailors that went far beyond friendship. Some saw it as loyalty, others as shame. Most never spoke of it again. Were these bonds acts of comfort in wartime, or a secret part of naval culture no one dared name? The truth was locked away with the men who lived it. Drop the time you're watching this. Early morning, late night, or somewhere in between. And if you want history told without filters, subscribe. No pressure, but the next story dives even deeper into what war tried to hide. You can almost taste the salt before you even see the water. The year is 1942, and Japan's Navy stretches across the Pacific like an iron spine. You stand on the deck of a destroyer at dawn, watching the horizon smear into gray. Around you, hundreds of men move in silence. Young, shaved, sunburnt, half asleep. Each one trained to serve the emperor with unblinking devotion. Each one taught that emotion is weakness, that individuality is a leak in the ship. And yet, beneath that rigid surface, something stirs that no uniform inspection can detect. Because the sea has always been a place where rules wash thin. War, for all its noise, has a way of forcing people into quiet intimacy. You eat together, sleep together, sweat under the same sky, and dream the same dream of surviving another day. It's in that closeness that boundaries blur. Not just between bodies, but between what's allowed and what's unspeakable. The Imperial Japanese Navy was obsessed with control, of ships, of strategy, of souls. But even here, on these floating cities of steel, the human heart didn't obey orders. When Japan plunged into total war, the Navy was its proudest child. Modeled after Britain's Royal Navy, but infused with samurai discipline, it was a force both elegant and brutal. Officers quoted Confucius one moment and barked punishments the next. You might think that such an institution left no room for tenderness, but history always hides its contradictions in plain sight. Diaries from sailors, those rare fragments that survived the censors, whispered of special friendships, inseparable comrades, and brothers of the heart. They never said the forbidden word, but everyone reading understood. You might wonder, how could such feelings exist in one of the most conservative militaries on Earth? The answer, oddly enough, lies in how Japan understood loyalty. The concept of nanshoku, male love, wasn't new. It had centuries of precedent, celebrated in samurai tales and Buddhist monasteries long before the war. The Tokugawa shoguns had their share of male companions. Kabuki actors were adored by both men and women. The Meiji modernization tried to bury that heritage under Western moral codes, but habits don't vanish, they submerge. By the time Japan entered World War II, those old customs had gone underwater, like coral beneath a new layer of empire. You feel it most in the bunk rooms, where 40 men share one narrow corridor. Air thick with sweat, sea brine, and the faint scent of machine oil. At night, when the engine hum becomes a lullaby, voices drop to whispers. Laughter travels quietly, and sometimes a hand rests on another shoulder a little longer than necessary. The Navy called it brotherhood. The men called it survival. After all, who else understood the terror of the ocean better than the one sleeping beside you? There's a letter from a young sailor found decades later in a family chest. He wrote to his superior, "When I see you on deck, I feel my chest become light. You teach me courage I didn't know I had." He signed it, not with a name, but with the character for Wave Anonymous, but eternal. Scholars believe the letter never reached its intended reader. It was hidden, perhaps out of fear. But even hidden, it spoke loudly of how affection disguised itself as discipline. The Navy had its own kind of theater, too. Officers drilled their men in ritualized obedience, but they also admired beauty. Sailors wrote haiku between battles, compared sunsets, even composed songs about comrades who never returned. That strange poetry of war, the mix of devotion, grief, and something softer that dared not speak its name, filled the logbooks between casualty counts. Imagine being there. You're 19, sleeping 3 hours a night. Your only family the man in the next hammock. You share cigarettes, rice balls, secrets about home. When he laughs, you forget the war for a moment. When he's gone, you feel the ocean itself grow heavier. No one tells you how to grieve, because grief isn't part of the training. So you hide it behind the same salute you give the emperor. That's how love survives here, disguised as duty. Even the officers weren't blind to it. Some turned a blind eye, others used it to bind loyalty. There were rumors, unproven but persistent, of captains who favored certain subordinates, keeping them close on long voyages, shielding them from punishment. One memoir hinted at relationships of extraordinary devotion, phrased so carefully that you can almost hear the author's hesitation through the paper. You sense he wanted to confess, but only dared to imply. The irony, of course, is that Japan's wartime ideology praised self-sacrifice between men as the purest form of patriotism. Kamikaze pilots wrote farewell letters filled with love for their comrades, even more than for their families. The state encouraged emotional intensity between soldiers, as long as it served the nation. They just couldn't call it what it was. The empire wanted loyalty without affection, passion without love, and faith without doubt. But human hearts don't follow military blueprints. As the ship's siren wails for morning drills, you see the contradiction in every face. Men ordered to die for the emperor, yet still craving someone who will remember their name when they're gone. That's the sea's cruelest secret. It swallows not only bodies, but truths. The waves crash louder now, and somewhere below deck, someone hides a folded letter in his uniform pocket. He'll carry it into battle, never read it aloud, but the ink will blur with sweat and salt until only the feeling remains. You might not know it yet, but this silent undercurrent, the mix of duty and forbidden tenderness, will shape everything that happens next in Japan's wartime navy. You wake to the sound of whistles and boots hammering the deck. 500 men scrambling to line up before the morning bell. The sea hasn't changed, but the men have. Yesterday they were farmers, carpenters, students with ink-stained fingers. Today, they are property of the emperor. You can see it in their eyes as the barber's clippers buzz through black hair, one head after another, stripping away the softness of youth. There's something ritualistic about it, like watching petals fall from the same flower, one by one, until nothing remains but the stem. Training turns boys into soldiers with the precision of a factory line. They learn to march, to shout, to obey before thinking. No emotion, No hesitation. That's the mantra. But you notice how each command hides a quiet irony. Because the more the instructors try to erase feeling, the more it clings like sweat to the skin. The recruits bathe together, sleep shoulder to shoulder, their bodies packed into tight barracks that make privacy a myth. In theory, it's brotherhood. In practice, it's something blurrier. One old instructor calls it Renai Kyototai, a community of love. He means it metaphorically, of course, but the words hang heavy in the air. You can almost hear the recruits suppressing a laugh, not because it's funny, but because it's too true. The Navy demands unity. The men give each other something dangerously close to intimacy. You wonder if the officers know. Oh, they know. They just don't name it. Picture this. It's lights out, and the barracks hum with snores and distant waves. A boy from Osaka lies awake, tracing the rhythm of the ship's engines through his mattress. His bunkmate beside him mutters in his sleep, hand brushing his arm. For a moment, he doesn't pull away. He's not thinking about politics or sin, only about warmth, about the comfort of another living being in a world designed to crush softness. He'll never tell anyone about that moment, but it will stay with him longer than the war itself. Discipline is everything here. Every meal is measured, every breath accounted for. But desire doesn't vanish under rules. It learns to adapt. The sailors invent their own vocabulary, half jokes, half confessions. Maru no naka no koi, they whisper. Love inside the circle, meaning love within the fleet. Some say it with a grin, others with a shrug, but everyone understands. In the Navy's floating world, emotions are both forbidden and inevitable. Even the propaganda posters can't help themselves. They show young men standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes fierce, hands gripping the same rope or cannon. The captions praise nakama, comradeship, as the soul of victory. You can't help but notice how tender some of those images look. Two faces close enough to share a breath, a hand on another's shoulder, lingering a second too long. It's loyalty, yes, but loyalty painted with a touch of longing. One historian later compared these dynamics to a state-sanctioned intimacy. The Navy, like many militaries, relied on closeness between men to fuel courage. But in Japan, that closeness echoed centuries of older traditions. Remember the samurai? They wrote poems to their male lovers between battles, calling them companions of the spirit. The Navy didn't invent this. It simply repackaged it under the emperor's name. Still, not every recruit embraced it. Some joked nervously about weirdos in the bunks. Others just kept quiet, afraid to say what they felt. You might recognize that fear. It's the same silence that lingers in locker rooms, dorms, or any place where young men are told to prove toughness by pretending they feel nothing. The difference is that here, silence could get you promoted. A rare diary from a 1943 cadet describes how he admired his senior officer as one might admire the moon. He writes that his heart moved strangely during drills, then quickly crosses out the line. Later he replaces it with, "I wish to serve with utmost respect." The ink doesn't lie, though. You can almost see him blush through the page, a ghost of affection hidden beneath perfect obedience. It's tempting to laugh, but that would miss the point. These weren't the rebels or romantics of later decades. They were kids caught in a system that both encouraged and punished feeling. A system that said, die for your comrade, but don't love him. How do you follow that order? Some recruits found humor as their only defense. They'd tease each other during bathing time, mock the officers' speeches about pure spirit, and whisper gossip about which crew had the most beautiful ensigns. Laughter, in this world, was a survival tactic. Because if you don't laugh, you start to think, and thinking is dangerous when the state owns your mind. The first months of service stripped everyone down to the same level. You learn to eat without talking, to sleep through alarms, to ignore the sting of salt in your cuts. You also learn the unspoken rule: never betray a comrade, no matter what. Loyalty wasn't just moral, it was erotic in its intensity. A misplaced glance could ruin you, but a shared secret could save your life. When you see two recruits sparring during drills, their sweat shining in the sun, it's hard not to notice the poetry hidden in the violence. Their movements are sharp, rehearsed, but when one pins the other, there's a flicker of something else, a tenderness buried under the mask of combat. It's fleeting, but real. By the time the ship finally leaves port, the transformation is complete. The recruits have become sailors. The boys have become men. Or at least, they've learned to act like it. Their bodies belong to the Navy, their emotions to no one. But underneath that crisp discipline, the old currents of Nanshoku still flow, quiet as the tide. You can almost feel it as the vessel glides into open water. 1,000 unspoken connections woven through fear, fatigue, and longing. The war hasn't even begun for them, but already the battles inside are louder than the ones ahead. You can hear it before you smell it. The rhythmic thud of the engines, the oily perfume of diesel, the metallic tang of sweat and salt. Welcome aboard a floating city. The destroyer Ikazuchi, the submarine I-58, the cruiser Yamashiro. They all share the same strange heartbeat. Steel corridors tight as arteries, bunks stacked 3 high, and no privacy except the few inches between your breath and the bulkhead. Out here, far from the shore, rank means less than proximity. The sea levels everyone. At first, the closeness feels suffocating. Men eat from the same tin bowls, shoulder to shoulder, knees brushing. Even sleep becomes a group exercise. You turn on your side, and there's always someone's elbow, someone's breath, someone's dream spilling into yours. The air never cools. It just thickens with noise and humidity. You start to forget where your body ends and another begins. The Navy calls this efficiency. You might call it unavoidable intimacy. That's how the bonds form, quietly, like rust spreading under paint. You don't notice it until one day you realize you've learned the pattern of another man's breathing. You know when he's about to laugh, when he's about to cry, when he's pretending to sleep because the night feels too long. The military doesn't have a word for this, but the heart does. Somewhere in the logbooks, the crewman's jokes about brothers in arms take on a new texture. One seaman writes, "He lent me his blanket, though I didn't ask." Another writes, "We shared the same pipe at night until the tobacco ran out." On paper, it's mundane. In the silence of the hull, it's something else entirely. War shrinks the world into fragments, and sometimes that fragment is another person's warmth. You can almost imagine it. After a 14-hour shift in the engine room, you collapse beside your crewmate, too tired to speak. He passes you his canteen, half empty, and mutters, "Don't die before payday." You both laugh, short, dry, real. Moments like that become currency. When the sirens sound at midnight, you already know whose eyes you'll meet first. Of course, The Navy's officers pretend not to notice. Officially, the Imperial Navy had moral codes borrowed from the old samurai ethos: chastity, discipline, loyalty to death. Unofficially, most captains preferred not to dig too deeply. As long as morale stayed high and the mission got done, what happened between hammocks stayed there. No trouble, no record, one surviving officer wrote in his post-war memoirs. A rule that sounds suspiciously like permission disguised as silence. Submarines were worse, or better, depending on who you ask. Imagine 50 men trapped inside a steel tube for weeks, barely able to stand upright. Every cough echoes, every touch is amplified. Submarine veterans used to say you could tell who your best friend was by who let you sleep closest to the ventilation pipe. In those conditions, personal space dissolves into legend. When one sailor gets sick, everyone catches it. When one dies, it feels like a hole torn through the entire crew. That kind of closeness makes words like friendship feel too small. It wasn't just survival, it was ritual. Sailors washed each other's backs, stitched each other's uniforms, even wrote small haiku on scrap paper for birthdays. You'd be surprised how often poetry sneaks into war. A mechanic aboard the Kirishima once scrawled on the engine casing, "Salt on my lips, but his hand steady beside mine. The storm will pass soon." No one ever erased it. You might think this sounds romanticized, but these little acts weren't fantasy. They were the only ways to reclaim humanity in a system that turned men into machinery. The Navy wanted discipline, it got devotion instead. And yet, danger lurked in every whisper. The military police, the dreaded Kempeitai, were known to make examples of immorality when rumors got too loud. Accused sailors could be reassigned to suicide missions or humiliated publicly. So affection learned to wear camouflage. Instead of love letters, there were maintenance logs. Instead of endearments, there were coded phrases: "You are my best compass," or "The sea feels calmer when you are near." In a world of censors, metaphors became weapons of survival. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes in veterans' testimonies decades later. One recalled a petty officer who kept a photo of another sailor hidden inside his cap. "It wasn't about lust," he said in an interview. "It was about remembering why I wanted to live another day." Another laughed. When asked if such relationships existed, you'd have to be blind not to see it. The irony? The Navy's code of Kaikyo no Seishin, spirit of the sea, encouraged loyalty, unity, and emotional dependence between sailors. They were told to treat one another like limbs of a single body. The propaganda called it the purity of brotherhood. The reality blurred that purity into something far more human. You might wonder if this kind of closeness distracted from the war effort. Actually, it often made crews stronger. Submarine crews with high cohesion had better survival rates. Shared affection made men fight harder, endure longer, grieve deeper. The Navy never admitted it, but love, by any name, was one of its best weapons. Sometimes, on calm nights, the men would climb to the deck to watch phosphorescent waves glowing beneath the hull. Someone would hum an old folk song from Kyushu, and others would join in, their voices low, blending with the sea. It wasn't patriotic. It was personal. For a few minutes, the empire, the emperor, and the endless war disappeared. Only the ocean listened. The next day, orders would come, drills would resume, and the machinery of empire would grind forward. But those small glimmers, those stolen seconds of warmth, were what kept the men from unraveling completely. The Navy thought it was training perfect soldiers. What it really forged were complex, fragile humans bound together by silence, salt, and the impossible need to care in a world that punished caring. Hook your ears to this sound, the thundering chant of Tenno Heika Banzai, echoing across a warship deck as the sun climbs over the Pacific. Every sailor roars it with perfect rhythm. Every arm snaps up in salute, and the ocean itself seems to bow. Its loyalty choreographed into music. But what no one says out loud is that the Empire's love language was always between men. You're told to die for your comrade, to devote yourself body and soul to your superior, to bond so tightly that your hearts beat as one. And yet, the same system that feeds you those words forbids you to mean them too deeply. Love beneath the Emperor's flag. That's what historians later called it. Half sarcasm, half truth. You might think it's impossible that such an authoritarian machine could depend on something as tender as affection, but that's the irony of wartime Japan. Emotion was both a tool and a threat. The Navy praised brotherhood so fiercely that it became a state religion. Officers wrote manuals describing the mutual devotion of comrades as the secret to bravery. Psychologists called it Aishin no Kokoro, the loving heart of the warrior. They meant it figuratively, but hearts don't always follow footnotes. You can imagine a young sailor reading those words in a handbook, half understanding, half smiling to himself. The same government that would punish perversion also encouraged men to express passionate loyalty. The line between love and duty was drawn in pencil, and every wave blurred it again. One naval poet, Lieutenant Yukio Mishima, though he became famous only later, once wrote about a soldier's beauty that blooms only when he faces death. His early fascination with male honor and devotion came straight from the wartime ethos he grew up in. He wasn't alone. Across the fleet, officers admired the symmetry of two men marching in step, dying together, leaving behind a story of perfect camaraderie. That's the kind of loyalty the propaganda wanted. Emotional enough to inspire, controlled enough not to embarrass the empire. The imperial education system had been planting this seed for decades. Boys in military schools were told that to love the emperor was to love one another as extensions of his body. Teachers compared comradeship to marriage, except holier, purer, because it existed without selfish desire. If that sounds like a contradiction, it's because it was one. But when you grow up believing the highest form of love is self-sacrifice for your fellow man, the leap from duty to affection isn't far. On the ships, that ideology became daily ritual. You see it when a senior petty officer guides a trembling recruit through his first air raid drill, hands firm on his shoulders, whispering, "You'll be fine." You see it when men kneel beside a wounded comrade and call him brother as the medics rush in. You see it in the letters they write home, not to girlfriends or wives, but to fellow sailors, describing bonds stronger than life. There's a reason so many kamikaze pilots left farewell notes addressed not to parents, but to comrades. "If you meet me again in the next life," one wrote, "let us serve together once more." That wasn't rhetoric. It was yearning disguised as patriotism. The empire turned devotion into ammunition, and it worked, until the human cost became too visible to hide. Even propaganda films hinted at it. Watch Hawaii Mere Oki Kaisen, The War at Sea from Hawaii to Malaya, Japan's 1942 blockbuster. The camera lingers on sailors' faces far longer than on explosions. You see their eyes meeting across the deck, the tiny gestures of reassurance, the tragic beauty of young men offering their lives for one another. The film pretends it's about victory. The emotion underneath is pure vulnerability. You might wonder how all this didn't collapse under its own hypocrisy. It nearly did. Officers who grew too attached to their subordinates risked being labeled weak. Recruits who showed excessive affection were reprimanded for feminine behavior. But here's the paradox. The same commanders who punished softness also depended on it to keep morale alive. A fleet without heart, one admiral famously said, is already sunk. So the Navy learned to channel that energy, to polish love until it looked like duty. When a sailor kissed another's forehead before a suicide mission, no one said a word. When men clutched hands during night bombardments, it was courage, not comfort. The Empire's greatest trick was convincing everyone that tenderness served the flag. And yet, the line sometimes slipped. One letter preserved by a post-war historian reads, "Your voice is my shore. When I hear it, I remember why I endure." It was signed with a naval code number, no name. The handwriting is neat, almost ceremonial. You can imagine the man who wrote it sitting under red emergency light, knowing every word might be censored, writing anyway. War propaganda needed heroes, but it accidentally immortalized longing. The posters of grinning sailors locking arms, the speeches about pure hearts bound in unity, all of it turned into unintentional confessions. Even Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast, urging loyalty, used the phrase Magokoro no Chikai, a vow of true heart, the language of romance wrapped in the uniform of empire. If you listen closely, you can still hear the heartbeat of that contradiction. The drums of nationalism, yes, but also the quiet hum beneath them, the rhythm of men learning how to care for each other in the only way they were allowed. The Empire may have painted that love in camouflage, but it couldn't erase it. And in that strange twilight between loyalty and desire, the Imperial Japanese Navy found both its strength and its secret. Because when the flag demanded absolute devotion, the sailors gave it. And then, quietly, they gave each other more. The air inside an officer's dormitory smells faintly of ink and seaweed paper. You step quietly past sliding doors lined with nameplates. Lieutenant Aoki, Ensign Tanabe, Commander Nakayama, and every room hums with the same symphony of scratching pens and murmured etiquette. Here, the war feels far away. You could almost mistake it for a boarding school, if not for the rifles resting neatly in the corner. This is where the Navy's intellectuals live, the educated elite from Tokyo Imperial University, Kyoto, Waseda. They read poetry during ration breaks, debate philosophy in whispers, and practice calligraphy on envelopes they'll never send. You might think that being part of the officer class meant freedom, but in truth, they were trapped too. Trapped in hierarchy, in etiquette, in the constant performance of stoic masculinity. Yet within that rigid frame, affection found its own coded language. One young officer, writing in 1944, confessed in his journal that he admired a fellow cadet whose spirit shines brighter than the sea. He wrote that every conversation with him felt like drinking moonlight. The sentence after that was blacked out by a censor's pen. When the diary resurfaced after the war, historians couldn't read what had been removed. Maybe a confession, maybe just a risk he couldn't take. You can almost hear the hesitation, a heartbeat caught between ink strokes. Letters were the safest form of rebellion. Officers used flowery phrasing that could mean anything or everything. The stars seemed closer tonight, as if they too listened for your voice. Your advice gave me calm waters during the storm. To an outsider, these read as harmless camaraderie, but among those who knew, they were the Navy's secret sonnets. If you think this sounds too poetic for a military world, you're right, and that's precisely why it worked. Poetry was the perfect disguise. No censor wanted to admit he didn't understand a metaphor. So, affection hid in plain sight. You could write a love letter and call it literature. You'd find these quiet relationships among the cadets of Itajima Naval Academy, the Harvard of the sea. Between grueling drills, students traded haiku, borrowed books, even held philosophy circles after curfew. There's a famous anecdote about an instructor catching two cadets sitting too close under a lamplight. He scolded them for improper conduct, but then added, "Such closeness should be reserved for battle." You can't help but hear the double meaning. He knew, and he chose mercy over exposure. Sometimes, these bonds crossed class lines. A lieutenant might mentor a young seaman, guiding him through naval codes, helping him read and write. The word used for this was Kohai Jr. and Senpai Sr., but inside those titles, something tender could bloom. The Senpai protected, the Kohai adored. To outsiders, it looked like mentorship. To those living it, it often felt like devotion. Think of it like this. When you're adrift on endless seas, the person who listens becomes the anchor. Some officers kept their favorite cadets nearby during postings, citing trust. They dined together, discuss poetry, share cigarettes during night watches. There's a photo from 1943. Two men in crisp white uniforms, one leaning slightly toward the other, their smiles hesitant but unmistakably personal. On the back, in faint pencil, "To my calm harbor." Of course, this world of paper and politeness had its risks. The Kempeitai didn't need evidence to destroy a career. Even rumor was enough. That's why everything stayed wrapped in implication. You might find two officers exchanging small gifts, a carved charm, a hand-folded paper crane, then immediately insisting it was for luck. The charm might disappear into a pocket, but the memory of the gesture stayed long after. Sometimes, literature became a mirror too dangerous to look into. Officers passed around novels by Ihara Saikaku or Natsume Soseki, writers who explored male affection centuries before. Reading such stories in wartime Japan was a small act of rebellion, a whisper to the past saying, "We remember." It's strange, isn't it? How history often loops back on itself. The same kind of love that had once been part of samurai culture was now a secret again. Not all stories ended tenderly. Some officers, terrified of exposure, overcorrected, mocking or punishing the very thing they felt. A few historians even suggest that harsh discipline sometimes masked inner guilt. He struck his men hardest when he feared his own heart, one memoir notes. The war turned emotions into weapons, affection twisted into cruelty, fear disguised as authority. Still, between the cracks, you find beauty. One Navy chaplain recalled officiating an informal ceremony, two officers exchanging oaths before battle, calling each other Chikai no Tomo, vowed friends. No document, no ring, no kiss. Just words whispered over the hum of the sea. The chaplain never reported them. They looked at peace, he wrote. You might pause and wonder, were these men truly in love, or simply clinging to the nearest soul in a collapsing world? Maybe both. War doesn't draw clean lines. It blurs everything. The officers who traded poems and glances weren't breaking rules so much as rewriting them, creating a fragile sanctuary within the Empire's iron machinery. And while the admirals planned strategies to conquer oceans, their subordinates quietly discovered the one thing the Empire could never command: tenderness. You can almost picture it. Ink drying on forbidden letters, a moonlit deck, two silhouettes framed by lantern light. The war raged, the Empire shouted, but inside that small circle of trust, there was a heartbeat that belonged to no one but them. Discipline in the Imperial Japanese Navy was not just a rule, it was a religion. You can feel it in every movement, every salute, every perfectly folded blanket. The word chowa, harmony, hung in the air like incense. But harmony, here, meant obedience. You didn't question, you didn't complain, and you definitely didn't let your emotions leak through the cracks. And if they did, well, the Navy had its own quiet ways of sealing them back up. Punishment didn't always come with shouts or chains. Sometimes it came with silence. You might suddenly find your name missing from the duty roster, your friends avoiding eye contact, your transfer papers stamped without explanation. Immorality, they'd whisper. That polite, suffocating word that covered everything from drunkenness to love. There were no official trials for such things. The Navy preferred what it called naibu shobun, internal handling. That meant your file vanished into a drawer, and you were reassigned to some remote port where no one asked questions. For the Empire, erasure was the cleanest form of justice. Why waste time punishing something that could simply stop existing? Still, everyone knew the stories. A petty officer from Yokosuka, caught writing affectionate letters to another sailor, disappeared, transferred to mainland. A group of recruits accused of indecent behavior during night duty, split up, sent to different fleets. The command called it discipline. The sailors called it ghosting by the Emperor. You could be erased for feeling too much. And yet, even in this rigid world, hypocrisy reigned. The same commanders who punished moral impurity tolerated drunken brawls, gambling, even brothel visits during shore leave. They claimed it kept the men healthy. But affection between sailors? That was a sickness, one you cured by exile. Sometimes, the punishment wasn't about sin. It was about control. The Empire feared anything it couldn't categorize. A man in love was unpredictable. He might choose loyalty to a person over loyalty to the flag. That terrified the system. It's the same reason authoritarian regimes everywhere mistrust intimacy. It breeds a kind of truth that propaganda can't compete with. Imagine being one of those sailors, summoned to the commander's office. The door slides shut, and the room feels smaller than your guilt. No accusation, no shouting. Just that careful, deliberate tone. You have failed to maintain discipline. You bow, apologize, but the decision's already written. You're being sent to another vessel, one rumored to have high mortality rates. You'll never see your comrades again. The officer dismisses you with a single nod. That's how love dies in silence. Still, humans are stubborn. Even fear has limits. Sailors learn to communicate in code, to hide tenderness in plain sight. A casual pat on the shoulder could mean, "I'm still here." Sharing food during night watch could mean, "I forgive you." They turned small acts of defiance into rituals that no officer could punish. One fascinating account comes from a veteran interviewed in the 1970s. He said, "They thought they could scare us out of caring, but it only made us care differently." He laughed softly before adding, "We just got better at pretending." That line says everything, doesn't it? Pretending became survival. The military's obsession with purity went beyond people. It extended to language. The official naval codebooks banned certain expressions considered too sentimental. You couldn't write, "I miss you," even to your family. You had to say, "I pray for your well-being." The empire policed not just behavior, but vocabulary. It's hard to imagine now, but back then, even the word love was considered subversive. Of course, sailors still found ways around it. They replaced love with courage, affection with spirit. It's why so many wartime letters sound strangely poetic. "I draw strength from your memory. Our friendship gives me courage." Phrases that, in another world, would simply mean, "I love you." Sometimes, discipline turned cruel. Public beatings were rare, but theatrical. The point wasn't pain, it was humiliation. "Let this be an example," the officer would say, while the other men stood frozen, watching. No one dared to move, because sympathy could be mistaken for guilt. It's strange how silence can be louder than screams. Still, there were small rebellions. Men smuggled forbidden books, like Saikaku's The Great Mirror of Male Love, or foreign novels translated secretly by scholars. Reading them was an act of resistance, a reminder that affection between men wasn't new or unnatural. It had existed long before the empire, and it would exist long after. Even the chaplains, those tasked with enforcing moral guidance, sometimes looked the other way. One of them later confessed, "They came to me for confession, but what sin could I name in kindness?" That might be the most honest sermon ever given in wartime Japan. You might ask, how did anyone keep their sanity under such quiet terror? The answer is, they didn't always. Some sailors became colder, crueler, turning their fear outward. Others retreated into silence, letting the sea swallow their secrets. But a few, just a few, refused to let the empire define what they felt. They learned to find freedom in the smallest gestures. One veteran told a historian, "They punished us for what kept us human." But the sea never told, and maybe that's the final irony. The ocean, vast and indifferent, became the only witness that didn't judge. Above deck, the sun sets like a wound over the horizon. The siren wails for evening drills, and you can almost hear the echo of all those lost names. Men who were disciplined into ghosts, yet left ripples that never stopped moving. They told you heroes don't cry, but the ocean proves them wrong. The first shell hits before dawn, and the sky turns white with fire. You grip the rail as the Yamato shudders, metal screaming, decks splintering. The Empire's last pride, the invincible ship, now groans like a dying animal. You shout for your comrades, your voice shredded by wind and smoke, and for a moment you don't know if the salt on your face is sea spray or tears. The history books call this glorious sacrifice. You'd call it chaos with paperwork. The air stinks of burning oil. The water foams black with debris, and orders echo like nonsense. Man your stations. Seal the compartments. But what do orders matter when the sea itself is on fire? Men stumble, crawl, drag one another across tilted decks. The line between bravery and panic blurs fast. A sailor beside you, his name might be Watanabe, or maybe just brother, shoves a life vest into your chest. You try to give it back. He laughs. You can't swim with honor, idiot. Then another blast throws you both down, and suddenly you're clinging to each other, because there's nothing else left to hold. That's the real story of courage. Not the slogans, not the emperor's radio speeches, but two terrified men refusing to let go while the empire sinks beneath them. When the Yamato went down in 1945, survivors didn't talk about glory. They talked about voices. The last words shouted across the deck weren't banzai. They were names. Tanaka. Sato. Come back. It's strange how war strips away everything except what matters most. Not the nation, not the flag, just the person next to you, the one who remembers who you are. Later, one survivor told a reporter, "He held my wrist until the water took us both." I don't know if I was trying to save him or myself. That line never made it into official records. The military didn't like sentences that sounded too human. The official version said, "Discipline maintained until the end." But you can hear the difference, can't you? One sounds like propaganda. The other sounds like love. Across the Pacific, hundreds of ships were dying the same way. On the Shinano, a torpedo tore through the hull, and two petty officers were last seen clasping hands as the lights went out. Their bodies were found later, still together. The report called it mutual assistance. The sailors who knew them called it what it was: devotion. You'd think in moments like these, fear would turn men selfish. It didn't. Some tied themselves together with rope so they wouldn't drift apart. Others gave away their last oxygen tanks or life vests. You can't call that anything but love. Disguised, desperate, unspeakable, but real. The Empire tried to erase emotion from its soldiers, and here it was, roaring back in the middle of hellfire. Even American rescuers noticed it. A U.S. Navy medic wrote in his journal, "They held on to each other constantly." It wasn't panic. It looked like habit. He didn't realize he was witnessing the end of a secret culture that had thrived below decks for years. Bonds forbidden in life became undeniable in death. And it wasn't just tragedy, it was defiance. Every time a sailor reached for another in the water, he was choosing humanity over obedience. The Imperial Code demanded death without attachment. The ocean demanded honesty. You can almost hear it in the silence after the last explosion fades. Men gasping, coughing, calling out through smoke, their words stripped bare of rank or ritual. Somewhere in that darkness, a voice starts singing, an old Navy hymn about returning home. Another joins in, then another. Soon the floating wreckage hums with song, quiet but steady, a chorus of ghosts refusing to disappear. For a moment, the sea itself seems to pause and listen. The Empire can sink, the ships can burn, but the sound of men remembering each other, that part doesn't die. When dawn finally breaks, the survivors float among the wreckage, their eyes red, their hands still linked. They don't shout banzai. They whisper names. That's how you know what love looks like in war. It's not pretty, not poetic, just stubborn. The world will call it duty, call it loyalty. Anything but what it truly was. But you were there. You saw it. You know the truth. The Emperor's empire went down with his fleet, but those bonds, those human, forbidden, blazing bonds, kept on floating long after the flag sank. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the ocean wanted all along, to keep a few pieces of love from drowning. The war ends not with an explosion, but with a whisper. August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's trembling voice crackles through the radio. Japan has surrendered. You're still in uniform, sitting on a crate near a ruined dock, surrounded by men who don't yet know whether to cheer or cry. Some stare at their hands, as if realizing they're still attached. Others just laugh, quietly. The kind of laugh that comes when you're too tired to feel relief. The empire has fallen, and with it, the only world you've ever known. You might think freedom arrives like sunlight, but it doesn't. It arrives like fog, thick, disorienting, full of ghosts. You look around and see familiar faces suddenly unfamiliar. The hierarchy collapses overnight. Admirals become prisoners. Officers bow to American interpreters. And those who once shouted about purity now whisper about survival. For many sailors, the surrender wasn't an ending. It was a cover-up. The same Navy that once demanded loyalty now demanded silence. Reports were destroyed, files burned, diaries confiscated. We will preserve the dignity of the imperial forces, the surviving admirals declared. What they meant was, we will erase what doesn't fit the myth. That meant you too. The quiet bonds, the friendships, the love stories that kept men alive, none of that made it into the new Japan. The victors wanted a country of clean slates and moral redemption. So anything that hinted at indecency or moral weakness vanished with the ashes of Tokyo. You were told to forget. You were told to start over. But memory is stubborn. Some sailors came home to find their families gone, their towns flattened. Others walked for days in the countryside, nameless, homeless, haunted. The empire had told them they were part of something eternal, and now they were just men. What do you do when you've been trained to serve an ideal that no longer exists? You cling to the fragments of what kept you human. A few veterans tried to confess, to priests, to doctors, to no one in particular. They spoke of the nights aboard ship, of the hands they still felt in their sleep. It wasn't wrong, one insisted to an interviewer years later. It was the only thing that was right. But in 1945, Japan wasn't ready to hear that. The American occupation brought new rules, new censorship, and a new kind of morality. One imported straight from Hollywood and Sunday school. The U.S. authorities rewrote Japan's penal codes, reinstating bans on public indecency that included same-sex acts. Ironically, pre-war Japan had been more lenient than its conquerors. The occupation forces, armed with Coca-Cola and Christian ethics, painted love between men as shameful, something un-Japanese. The irony is almost too thick to swallow. So you keep your silence. You get a factory job. You bow when told. Maybe you marry because everyone expects it. You have children who never hear about the man who once held your hand in the dark of the Pacific. You tell them stories about discipline, honor, the Navy's glory, but never about the letters you burned before the surrender. And yet, the past leaks through in strange ways. A melody from training camp hums through your mind while you're fixing a bicycle. A scent of sea oil makes your chest tighten. A film about the war plays in a Tokyo theater, and you find yourself scanning every frame, searching for faces that never came home. You don't find them, but your pulse still quickens when the actors shout, "Banzai," as if the sound carries ghosts. There's one story that lingers. A group of sailors returning from a southern island in late 1946. They stop at a small shrine near Hiroshima, where the trees still grow crooked from the blast. One man kneels and places two Navy badges side by side on the altar. "For both of us," he says softly. His friend was lost at sea, but he still brings the offering every year. To the villagers, he's just another veteran paying respect. But to him, it's a reunion. Japan, under occupation, reinvented itself as modern and modest. The Navy's history was rewritten into a tale of sacrifice and tragedy, but never of tenderness. Even the museum stayed quiet about the things that didn't fit the narrative. The American curators wanted discipline, not affection, loyalty, not longing. And so, for decades, the story of those forbidden bonds sank beneath layers of national shame. But deep down, you know, forgetting is impossible. Every night, you lie awake, and the ceiling blurs into the same steel-gray sky you once watched from the deck. You remember his voice calling your name through the gunfire. You remember how his laughter cut through the noise like sunlight on waves. The war took everything, but not that. And maybe that's the cruelest truth about peace. It doesn't erase what war revealed. It just teaches you to keep it quieter. You walk past the harbor years later. Older now, slower. A fishing boat passes, its crew laughing, and for a second, you hear the echo of your youth in their voices. You smile without meaning to. Somewhere out there, beneath the waves, the wrecks of your ships rest like sealed letters that history never opened. But you know what they say. You always did. Time moves strangely after war. Decades pass, but the sea still sounds the same. The men who once ruled the waves now shuffle through quiet neighborhoods, their medals packed away in drawers. Japan has rebuilt. Neon towers, bullet trains, vending machines that hum like lullabies. But somewhere behind all that modern glitter, the ghosts of the Navy still breathe. You can almost hear them in the sound of rain against tin roofs, like Morse code from another life. The ones who remembered didn't talk easily. For years, silence was loyalty's last order. But old men grow careless with secrets. By the 1970s, a few began to speak. Softly, haltingly, as if testing the air for forgiveness. They told stories that didn't sound like the war movies. Stories about special comrades and bonds of the heart. They never used the word love, but the meaning sat between every syllable. You imagine one of them, maybe in a nursing home outside Yokohama, sitting beside a tape recorder. His hands tremble as he adjusts the microphone. "We were not bad people," he begins. "We were just lonely." He laughs, the dry, careful sound, and adds, "They told us to love the emperor. We chose each other instead." Historians found these tapes years later, brittle with age but still clear. They called it oral history. You'd call it confession. And listening to them, you realize these men weren't trying to justify themselves. They were trying to remember how it felt to be human in a world that punished humanity. Some of them wrote novels instead. A former petty officer published The Sea Between Men, a thinly veiled account of two sailors whose friendship defies military order. Critics called it melancholy and unrealistic. The author just smiled in interviews and said, "It happened more often than you think." The book sold poorly, but among veterans, it passed from hand to hand like contraband scripture. There were others too. Poets, filmmakers, academics, each tugging at threads the empire had tried to bury. One historian found a set of censored letters in a Navy archive. 59 correspondences between two officers stationed in Micronesia. The language was so formal, it bordered on sacred. "Your words steady my spirit," one wrote. "When I close my eyes, I see you standing at attention under the rising sun." Every letter signed with the same phrase, "I serve you as I serve the nation." To the censors, that sounded patriotic. To anyone else, it sounds heartbreakingly intimate. Of course, not everyone wanted these memories dug up. Japan's post-war identity rested on a fragile foundation of shame and pride. The state preferred to frame its soldiers as tragic, not complicated. "Keep the past clean," a politician once warned during a press conference about war literature. Clean, as if history were a uniform you could wash. But memory doesn't clean, it stains. And those stains began to show. In the 1980s, documentaries quietly interviewed surviving sailors, men now in their 60s and 70s. They described nights aboard ship when the sea was calm and everything felt suspended between duty and desire. One smiled as he recalled singing duets during watch duty. He had a terrible voice, but when he sang, the ship stopped feeling like prison. You can almost hear the laughter in that sentence, the kind that carries both fondness and regret. That's how most of these men talked, balancing on the thin edge between nostalgia and grief. They didn't need sympathy. They just wanted someone to listen. One particularly moving interview comes from a man named Nakahara, a cook aboard a submarine during 1943. When asked if those kinds of relationships existed, he paused, looked away, and said, "We loved in silence. The ocean was our witness." Then he smiled, a little embarrassed, and added, "I hope God forgives us, but I also hope he doesn't change a thing." What strikes you most isn't their guilt, it's their gentleness. These weren't radicals or rebels. They were men who found small acts of compassion in a machine built for destruction. And as they aged, their memories became their rebellion. Every retold story was a quiet middle finger to the empire that taught them to forget. By the 1990s, scholars began calling this the suppressed queer memory of the Imperial Navy. But the veterans didn't use words like queer or identity. They just said omoid, memory. For them, it wasn't ideology. It was survival. A truth carried too long to be denied. In one documentary, a historian reads aloud a letter recovered from a wreck site in the South China Sea. The paper, water-stained but legible, says, "If this ship sinks, let it sink with our story." The camera lingers on her face as she reads. "They never tell us what story," she says softly. "But you know, you always knew." What makes these testimonies so haunting isn't the tragedy, it's the tenderness. You can feel it in every shaky voice, every tearful laugh. They don't sound like men confessing sin. They sound like men remembering love. And after a lifetime of silence, that's all they ever wanted, to remember out loud. As they speak, Japan listens, uneasy, uncertain, but listening. Because the empire may have died in 1945, but its ghosts never stopped asking to be heard. They buried the truth beneath the waves, but the sea never keeps secrets forever. 80 years later, the tide is still whispering. You stand on a gray morning shore at Kure, watching waves slap against barnacled steel, what's left of the ships that once carried the emperor's will. Tourists stroll past with cameras. School kids eat ice cream near a rusted anchor, and yet, if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear the echo of men laughing, arguing, singing, loving, in the heartbeat of the surf. Japan rebuilt itself into glass and neon, but history still leaks through the cracks. For decades, no one dared to speak of the Navy's hidden tenderness. Now, those stories are surfacing like driftwood, faded, scarred, but unmistakably alive. Filmmakers, historians, and grandchildren of sailors are finding what the Empire tried to drown, evidence that love survived even in a world designed to destroy it. A few years ago, a small Tokyo film called Sea of Souls told the story of two wartime sailors whose loyalty crosses into something deeper. It didn't win awards, but audiences cried quietly in the dark. One reviewer wrote, "It's not about sin. It's about the only kind of love war couldn't kill." And just like that, the silence cracked. In universities, professors teach new courses on gender and the Imperial Navy, showing students letters once stamped classified. Those letters, written on thin naval stationery, speak with heartbreaking restraint. Your courage steadies me. I sleep easier knowing you're near. Each line walks the knife edge between duty and desire. Scholars call it the language of camouflage. You call it honesty in disguise. Art, too, has joined the resurrection. In Hiroshima, a sculptor cast two bronze sailors standing inches apart, close enough that their shadows merge on sunny days. The plaque reads, "The space between them is the story." No one says the word love, but everyone feels it. You notice how public sentiment has softened. Young activists organize exhibitions titled "The Hidden Heart of the Navy." Families bring faded photos, some still in tin boxes that smell faintly of the sea. A granddaughter lifts a yellowed letter from her grandfather's uniform pocket. The handwriting trembles, but the words don't. "You were my calm harbor." The crowd goes silent. No one needs to translate. Of course, not everyone approves. Politicians mutter about revisionist history. Commentators complain that romanticizing soldiers disrespects their sacrifice. But maybe truth isn't disrespect. It's repair. To remember, tenderness doesn't erase suffering. It redeems it. Japan has told the story of war through fire and shame for decades. Perhaps now, it's time to tell it through compassion. You visit the Naval Museum at Yokosuka and find a display titled "Unrecorded Lives." Inside, two photographs. Two sailors laughing on deck, arms slung around each other, their faces sunlit and free. The label says, "Unidentified Crew, 1943." But you can feel their names even if no one speaks them. You can almost hear their voices under the hum of the air conditioning. What's remarkable is how time has turned silence into scripture. The same empire that punished affection gave birth to the most enduring proof of it. The waves that swallowed the ships preserved their stories. Divers still bring up artifacts from wrecks, dog tags, buttons, journals sealed in oilskin. One journal found near Okinawa contained a single line untouched by time. "Even if the sea takes us, let it carry our hearts together." And now, at last, the sea has returned those hearts. You see it in theater plays that imagine the inner lives of forgotten sailors, in poetry readings where young men whisper old letters aloud, in scholars' voices trembling as they present evidence long hidden by censors, in online archives where you can hear, in crackly audio, an old veteran chuckling softly before saying, "We thought the ocean would keep our secret." Instead, it told everyone. There's a strange peace in that. Maybe it's justice, maybe it's grace, because every empire believes it can control memory. But love is the only soldier that never retires. The sun sinks behind the inland sea, orange bleeding into blue. The waves hiss and glitter as if the past is exhaling. You close your eyes, and the sound almost becomes a lullaby. The echo of boots on deck, the hush of shared laughter, the rhythm of two heartbeats out of time with war. The empire is gone. The uniforms are dust. But the tide keeps rising, whispering the same truth over and over. They were here. Not heroes, not sinners, just men who found warmth in the coldest chapter of history. And maybe that's the truest victory of all. Turns out, the sea never really forgot. It just waited. All those stories of quiet love and loyalty came back with the tide, proof that even in war, people still found ways to care. But the ocean wasn't the only one keeping secrets. On land, Japan's World War II, Army had its own hidden world, where duty and desire marched side by side. They say silence is the first uniform you wear. You step off the train into a field of khaki, the smell of wet wool and coal dust thick enough to taste. Around you, thousands of young men shuffle in unison, heads shaved, eyes lowered, hearts hammering in identical rhythm. You're not just joining an army. You're stepping into a machine that eats the individual whole and spits out something called soldier. The sergeant doesn't yell your name. He doesn't have to. You've already stopped being a name. You're a number, a pair of boots, a single brushstroke in the Emperor's painting of destiny. He barks, and you move before you even understand the command. That's the first lesson. Think too slowly, and the man behind you catches the punishment meant for you both. In the Japanese Imperial Army, collective responsibility means everyone bleeds together, or not at all. Your first meal looks like someone whispered rice over a bowl of boiling water. The pickled plum in the center is supposed to symbolize the flag. Red circle, white background, but it feels more like a joke. The officer supervising the meal doesn't smile. He reminds you to be grateful, because a soldier's duty isn't to eat, it's to endure. You swallow hard, because that's the second lesson. Endurance is the only luxury you can afford. At night, the barracks hum with the sound of snoring and stifled coughing. Someone whispers that soldiers in the Navy get fish in their soup. You almost laugh, but laughter is dangerous here. Every gesture is watched, every sound carries, and even a yawn at the wrong moment can earn you a slap across the face. The corporal who hit you will later apologize, in writing, to his superior, not to you. Discipline in this world is less about justice and more about choreography. By the third day, your body doesn't belong to you. The boots you wear feel like they've grown into your bones. You march, you bow, you shout, you sweat. Every action fused to orders, barked like percussion. And yet, there's a strange comfort in the predictability of it. No choices, no doubts, just movement, just obedience. In a world so chaotic, being told what to do almost feels like peace. Still, you can't help noticing the absurdities. The officers make you polish your mess tin until you can see the reflection of a mosquito on it, then order you to dig trenches that collapse in the rain. You're told to love your rifle like a bride, but never question why you have to sleep with it under your head. It's not romance. It's paranoia dressed as devotion. One morning, the drill instructor orders everyone to shout their devotion to the Emperor. 1,000 voices rise together. Tenno Heika Banzai! 10,000 years to His Majesty. You yell until your throat burns, and somewhere between the third and fourth repetition, your own voice disappears into the collective roar. You can't tell if it's patriotism or hypnosis, but it works. At the same time, you start seeing the invisible ranks within the ranks. The Tokyo boys sneer at the rural recruits from Kyushu. The sons of school teachers mock the farmers who can't write their names straight. The Imperial Army loves unity in theory, but hierarchy in practice. Even among those condemned to the same rice gruel, someone always finds a way to feel superior. The only real equalizer is exhaustion. After 14 hours of drilling under the summer sun, no one cares who your father was. You all stink the same. You all crave sleep the same. The human body becomes democratic under pain. You also begin to realize that silence isn't emptiness, it's survival. You learn when to nod without thinking, when to look busy, when to look invisible. There's an art to avoiding notice, a kind of stealth worship. You polish boots slowly enough to seem meticulous, but quickly enough not to look lazy. You salute with just enough energy to signal respect, but not enough to look desperate. It's like performing an endless play, where the wrong expression can end your career, or your life. And in that performance, something eerie happens. You start to forget who you were before the uniform. Your handwriting gets stiffer, your laughter rarer, your thoughts smaller. You catch yourself saying watashi instead of or, the polite I instead of the casual one. You start calling yourself soldier even when you're alone. Every morning begins with a bow to the emperor's portrait. It's a photograph framed in wood, slightly crooked from humidity, but you're told that his divine spirit inhabits it. You bow anyway, deeply. Because what if it's true? What if he is watching? The thought keeps your spine straight, even when your legs shake. Sometimes you wonder, does he ever think of you? The man in the portrait, the shining god in the newspaper headlines. Does he know you haven't eaten properly in 3 days? Does he know your feet bleed through your socks? You push the thought away, because doubt is a sin here. When rain comes, it doesn't cool the air. It turns the ground into soup. You stand guard in it, your rifle slick and your stomach hollow. Someone faints, face first into the mud, and the corporal shouts for the rest to keep standing. You obey, of course. There's a strange comfort in cruelty shared by all. It spares you from loneliness. By the time night returns, you don't dream of home anymore. You dream of silence. Thick, clean, empty silence. A world without shouting, without orders, without the weight of an unseen gaze judging your every move. But the dream fades as quickly as it comes, replaced by the bugle's cry that tomorrow you'll do it all again. And that's how it begins. Not with courage or glory, but with quiet surrender. Not to an enemy, but to the system itself. You don't notice it happening. You only realize, much later, that your first battle wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with identity, and you already lost. The barracks are your new home, and home smells like damp straw and boiled miso. You wake up before the sun does, because the whistle doesn't care about sleep. The air bites at your skin as you fumble for your uniform, in the dark, half awake, half resentful, trying not to trip over the wooden sandals of the man sleeping beside you. If you ever wondered what sharing space means, the Imperial Army has a clear definition. Every breath, every cough, every secret is now communal property. The walls are thin enough that you can hear a man's heartbeat if you listen closely. Every rustle, every turn, every snore is public sound. Privacy isn't a right, it's a memory. And when you think of your old futon at home, That tiny slice of peace now feels like a luxury more expensive than gold. Funny how fast comfort becomes a myth once someone takes it away. Breakfast arrives in the form of watery rice and something that might once have been a fish. You learn not to ask questions about food here. Curiosity only leads to disappointment. There's always that one optimist in every platoon, the kind of man who says, maybe tomorrow we'll get eggs. You learn to love him quietly because his hope feeds everyone else more than the meal itself. You also learn the subtle politics of eating. The quickest hand doesn't always win because seniority is sacred. A sergeant's bowl is always fuller than a private's, no matter how equally they marched. It's not greed. It's the invisible architecture of hierarchy. The Imperial Army doesn't need walls to divide you. It uses spoons instead. After breakfast comes inspection. 1,000 eyes scan 1,000 uniforms, and even a loose thread becomes a sermon on discipline. If your buttons don't gleam, you'll polish them until your reflection looks back at you like a ghost. The corporal reminds everyone that a dirty soldier reflects a dirty nation. You start to understand that in this army, cleanliness isn't about hygiene. It's about ideology. You sweep the barracks floor with a brush smaller than your hand. You polish your rifle until the metal burns your fingers. You line your sandals with such precision that a ruler could salute them. It's obsessive, absurd, almost comical, but also strangely meditative. There's something soothing in repetition, in the way the body remembers tasks long after the mind forgets why. Once, during rest hour, a senior soldier named Takahashi leans over and says, "Remember this, you don't live in the barracks live in you." You don't understand at first, but later, when you wake at night and automatically fold your blanket in perfect corners without thinking, you realize what he meant. The discipline seeps in like rain through wood. It reshapes you quietly, patiently, irreversibly. There's a rhythm to the barracks life. Scrub, boo, report, repeat. The floorboards creak in time with your heartbeat. The corporal's sandals click like a metronome of fear. Yet between those mechanical beats, little moments of humanity sneak through. A muffled laugh, a shared cigarette stub, a story whispered through the dark. That's how soldiers survive the monotony, by pretending routine has meaning. Sometimes you find humor in absurd places, like the way men argue about who snores louder, or how one recruit insists his home prefecture's rice could win wars. You smile, even risk a chuckle, and the tension softens for a second. But when the sergeant's footsteps echo down the hall, every grin evaporates like steam. You go back to stone faces and folded hands, praying his mood isn't stormy today. Bath time feels like a sacred event. The wooden tub is barely large enough for 3, but somehow 6 of you fit. The water turns cloudy within minutes, but no one complains. Soap slides, elbows bump, laughter bubbles up. For a fleeting moment, the line between soldier and boy blurs. You're not warriors. You're just tired men trying to scrub away the smell of fear. Lights out means nothing here. The oil lamp flickers, the rain drums on the roof, and someone hums an old folk song about the sea. You find yourself humming along, not because you like it, but because it reminds you that sound still exists outside orders. Music, even off-key, feels like rebellion whispered into the dark. If this were a modern workplace, you might call it team bonding. But the Army's version is far harsher. Camaraderie is built through suffering, not social events. You share everything: food, sweat, insults, and somehow that shared discomfort forges trust. No one says it aloud, but the man who marched beside you through the mud is closer than a brother. Every evening, before sleep, you kneel in line and bow toward the emperor's portrait again. The sergeant reads from the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, his voice trembling with reverence. Duty is heavier than a mountain. Death is lighter than a feather. You mouth the words by rote, like a prayer you don't believe but can't afford to question. And somewhere, in the middle of those rituals, you start to sense the quiet genius behind them. This isn't just training, it's transformation. The Army doesn't build fighters, it builds faith. Every bow, every chant, every uniform inspection is a sermon in disguise. You're being rewired to see obedience as holiness, submission as pride. It's strange. Before the war, you thought discipline was about control. Now you see it's also about comfort. Knowing what to do, when to do it, and how to do it means you don't have to think. And not thinking is the only peace the Army allows. When the lamp finally dies and the night presses in, you lie awake listening to the breathing of 100 strangers who have somehow become family. The smell of sweat and tatami fills your nose. The sound of rain seeps into your dreams, and for a moment, you forget where the Army ends, and you begin. You'd think discipline meant rules, but here, discipline means pain dressed up as virtue. The morning begins, as usual, with shouting. The kind of shouting that scrapes the inside of your skull like a rusted nail. The corporal strides down the line, bamboo stick in hand, eyes gleaming with the authority of a minor god. He's barely older than you, but the uniform has inflated him into something holy. Someone sneezes during roll call. The stick comes down fast. One sharp crack, a gasp, then silence again. Nobody moves to help. Nobody dares. The lesson isn't about the sneeze. It's about control. You're not supposed to have reflexes anymore. You're supposed to be a vessel for command, pure and empty. This is how they teach spirit. In the Japanese Imperial Army, a soldier's body doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the emperor. Pain is not punishment. It's purification. They call it kyoiku, education, and they mean it literally. Every blow teaches obedience more effectively than a textbook ever could. You remember how, in school, teachers used to say, Japan was built on harmony and respect. Out here, harmony sounds like the synchronized slap of bare feet running drills in the rain. Respect looks like a man kneeling on gravel until his knees bleed. You start to realize that culture and cruelty often wear the same uniform. The day stretches on like melted wax. Drills, shouts, drills again. Faster, lower, again. It doesn't matter if your muscles ache or your vision blurs. You move because not moving is worse. And if you stumble, someone hits you. Not because they hate you, but because that's how the system breathes. One man's pain fuels another man's fear, and fear keeps the Army alive. Sometimes, the absurdity almost makes you laugh. Like when the officer scolds a recruit for bowing at the wrong angle, 45 degrees instead of 30. He shouts that this disrespect could endanger the empire. You stand there wondering how the tilt of a man's spine could decide the fate of a nation, but you wisely keep that thought to yourself. The indoctrination runs deep. Every morning, they remind you that Japan is divine, that the emperor is your father, and that dying for him is the highest form of love. They call it Seishin Tanren, the forging of the spirit. It sounds poetic, but in practice, It's just suffering refined into ritual. You start to wonder whether belief is something you choose or something beaten into you until you can't tell the difference. During a rare moment of rest, Takahashi, the same senior who once told you the barracks lived in you, leans against the wall and says, "Pain makes you remember who's in charge." You ask him if he means the officers. He smiles. "No, pain itself." You're not sure if he's joking. You learn to anticipate the blows. You learn to bow before being told, shout before being ordered, and apologize for things you haven't done yet. The Army calls this efficiency, but sometimes, in the quiet of the night, you think of it as domestication, like a farmer breaking a horse, except the horse learns to thank him for the saddle. There's one corporal everyone fears, a man named Nakamura. He's small, wiry, with eyes that look like they've seen too much sun and too little mercy. He has a habit of whispering before he strikes. Somehow, that's worse than shouting. Rumor has it he once beat a recruit unconscious for folding his blanket unevenly. The man recovered, but his smile never did. Yet, paradoxically, Nakamura is also respected. In a strange way, cruelty earns admiration here. The logic goes that if a man can endure suffering, he's strong. And if he can inflict it without hesitation, he's righteous. You watch this logic unfold day after day until it stops shocking you. That's the scariest part. Not the violence itself, but how normal it starts to feel. When drills end, you're drenched in sweat and humiliation, but you don't break. Nobody does. The secret isn't strength, it's numbness. You learn to retreat inside your head, to build small, private rooms of thought where no officer can reach you. A song, a smell, a memory, tiny rebellions of the mind that keep you human. Sometimes you catch glimpses of the instructors when they think no one's looking. Their shoulders sag, their eyes dull, their hands tremble ever so slightly. It dawns on you. They're prisoners too, chained by the same system they enforce. The cruelty is recycled, passed downward like a family heirloom no one dares throw away. And yet, within this storm of discipline, a strange intimacy forms. The man beside you might not know your first name, but he knows the sound you make when your ribs crack under a blow. He knows how you grit your teeth to hide tears. He'll slip you half a rice ball when no one's watching. In a world where kindness is forbidden, even the smallest mercy feels revolutionary. One night, as the lamps flicker low, you overhear a whispered joke about the emperor's portrait falling during a windstorm. Someone mimics the officer's panic, shouting, "Protect His Majesty's photograph." The laughter that follows is quiet but dangerous, a shared breath of rebellion. For a moment, you all remember you're still human. Then, like a candle snuffed out, the laughter dies. You lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the bamboo mat biting into your skin. You think about the words carved into every soldier's heart: loyalty, honor, sacrifice. They sound noble, but here they taste like sweat and fear. You wonder, if loyalty requires breaking yourself, what part of you will be left to give? Tomorrow will bring the same drills, the same beatings, the same chants. But you'll rise anyway, because somewhere deep inside, beneath the bruises and the slogans, a tiny voice still whispers, you are not just a uniform. They tell you, brotherhood is sacred, but no one warns you how dangerous love can be when uniforms replace names. By now, You know the rhythm of Army life so well, it moves your body before your brain. You stand, march, eat, and salute as one organism. But inside that machine, something quietly human begins to stir. Connection. It starts small. Maybe just the man who hands you his canteen on a blistering march, or the one who silently swaps guard duty with you when fever grips your stomach. Friendship here grows in the cracks discipline can't seal. The Army loves to preach about comradeship, but only the official kind, the one painted in posters and speeches, where men charge into bullets shouting loyalty to the Emperor. The real version is messier, quieter, born in whispers after lights out. It's not about heroism. It's about survival. You learn who snores, who steals extra rations, who can be trusted to warn you before the corporal rounds the corner. These tiny loyalties feel more real than any patriotic chant. You and Takahashi start sharing everything. Soap, stories, silence. One night, he passes you a scrap of paper torn from an old magazine. It's a poem by Yosano Akiko, the pre-war poet who once begged soldiers to return alive. Dangerous words in a time where dying beautifully was the ideal. You read it twice, feel the lump in your throat, and tuck it inside your uniform lining. That poem becomes your hidden amulet. But affection is a risky currency. The same system that starves you of warmth punishes you for finding it in each other. The officers preach purity of spirit, meaning loyalty must flow upward, to the Emperor, not sideways to your peers. Too much laughter, too much closeness, it's unmilitary. The sergeant warns that soft hearts lead to soft men, and everyone knows what soft implies. So you learn to mask fondness as formality. A pat on the shoulder becomes a salute. A quiet glance replaces a word. Still, the human need leaks through. A touch here, a shared grin there. Small, forbidden gestures that make life bearable. In this loneliness, even a joke feels like rebellion. You and your bunkmates create secret languages with looks and grunts. Entire conversations disguised in gestures. It's astonishing how much warmth fits into silence. Then there's betrayal, the flip side of brotherhood. The same bonds that keep you alive can also destroy you. Rumors drift through the barracks. Someone got caught mocking the Emperor. Someone else whispered about desertion. The accused are marched away before dawn. No one asks where. You all know better. The next day, their names vanish from the roster like they never existed. The only trace left is the tension hanging over the soup bowls at breakfast. Takahashi once tells you, in this place, trust is a luxury, and luxuries get confiscated. You laugh, but you both know he's right. Every friendship is built on borrowed time. One careless word, one overheard joke, and a bond becomes a liability. You start talking less, even to him. That's how the system wins, by turning affection into ammunition. Yet even under that weight, some choose to defy it. You hear about units stationed in Manchuria, where soldiers formed brotherhoods so tight they called themselves Ichiban Kumiai, the first union. Men who'd share food, punish their own superiors for cruelty, and protect one another with an almost spiritual loyalty. They were quietly admired, but also feared. The Army disbanded them quickly, labeling them morally suspicious. It's easy to forget, amid all this, that these were mostly boys, 18, 19, 20. They weren't fanatics. They were kids who grew up in rice fields, then got handed rifles and told they were divine weapons. The Army demanded they become gods, but treated them like replaceable screws. So when one soldier shared half a rice ball, or patched another's torn sleeve. That tiny act of kindness was the last thread connecting them to humanity. During field training one afternoon, a soldier from your squad collapses from heat stroke. The instructor orders everyone to keep marching, shouting, "Weakness dishonors the Emperor." Takahashi hesitates, torn between compassion and command. You both break ranks to drag the man into shade. Later, punishment comes, hard and loud, but you do it again. There's a kind of joy in disobedience when it's for the right reason. At night, bruised and aching, you find yourself thinking, maybe loyalty isn't what they say it is. Maybe it isn't shouting slogans or dying on command. Maybe loyalty is the quiet act of keeping another man alive when the world tells you not to care. The longer the war stretches, the more these moments matter. You share a laugh over burnt rice, swap memories of beaches and school festivals, hum old folk songs about cherry blossoms falling too soon. Sometimes, in those rare seconds of ease, it almost feels like you're not soldiers but travelers on the same impossible road. But the cracks widen, officers grow more paranoid, the punishments more random. You learn not to linger too long with anyone, not to talk unless necessary. Trust becomes an endangered species. Takahashi gets transferred to a frontline unit, and his absence feels like an echo that won't fade. The next morning, his bedroll is gone, neatly folded, perfectly aligned, as though he never slept there at all. You never hear from him again. The army doesn't do farewells. It only does orders. But sometimes, when the wind cuts through the barracks, you think you hear his voice humming that poem under his breath. Maybe it's your imagination. Maybe it's memory refusing to obey. And that's the cruel irony. You were told comradeship was sacred, but no one said it would hurt this much. The Emperor's portrait watches from the wall, smiling faintly as if to say, "See, even your love belongs to me now." Letters become the only proof you exist. After months of drills and marches, the thought of paper and ink feels like a luxury beyond rank or rations. You wait for your turn with the unit's shared fountain pen, its nib cracked, its barrel sticky with old ink. When your hands finally wrap around it, you're not just writing a letter. You're reaching for the version of yourself that existed before uniform and mud replaced your skin. You start with the usual. I am healthy, my comrades are fine, our spirits are strong. Lies, of course, but they're necessary ones. Every letter passes through censors who read your words before your family ever will. Too much honesty could brand you unpatriotic, so you learn the art of coded truth. The sun is bright here means you're marching under unbearable heat. We eat well means you're still alive. My spirit is unbroken means you cried quietly into your sleeve last night. Writing becomes its own kind of rebellion. You can't complain aloud, but you can smuggle emotion between the lines. You fold tenderness into the rhythm of polite formality, like a secret melody beneath a military march. You end every letter with, "For His Majesty's glory." But what you really mean is, "Don't forget me." Sometimes you receive letters back, thin envelopes smelling faintly of soap and seaweed. Your mother's handwriting trembles with forced optimism. She writes about the harvest, your younger brother's school, the cat that still sleeps on your futon. There's always a sentence that feels like a wound. Your father prays for your honorable service. He doesn't write himself. Maybe he can't. Maybe he already knows what happens to fathers who bury sons in silence. Others receive letters too. And for a few precious minutes, the barracks glow with laughter and nostalgia. Men crowd around, trading snippets like currency. My wife sent pickled plums. My son drew me a picture. Then someone doesn't get a letter. You notice his hands shake slightly at mealtime, his voice cracking when he shouts commands. He'll never mention it, but you see it anyway. Silence here carries its own stories. You learn that love in wartime Japan has to hide behind respectability. Soldiers are supposed to love only the emperor. Anything else is indulgence. So men write to their mothers instead of their lovers, call affection duty, and disguise longing as devotion. Some even burn old letters before inspections, afraid a sentimental phrase might be seen as weakness. Paper turns to ash, and with it goes the only proof that tenderness ever existed here. There are exceptions. You remember a soldier from Nagasaki, barely 20, who wrote poems on scraps of wrapping paper. Simple verses about rain, wind, and the scent of plum blossoms. The officers laughed, called him soft, but his words passed from hand to hand like contraband, keeping men awake long after lights out. When he died of malaria in Burma, someone recopied his poems and hid them inside a mess tin. Decades later, school children would recite them without knowing who he was. Sometimes, during downtime, you and a few others gather near the laundry line, trading fragments of home. One man talks about his fiancée's red kimono. Another recalls his daughter's first steps. You join in, describing your mother's miso soup as if it were a temple offering. Everyone nods solemnly, pretending to taste it in memory. For a moment, the war fades, replaced by a simple hunger for normalcy. The army, of course, tries to regulate even this. Propaganda posters insist that a soldier's heart belongs only to the emperor. They show smiling wives waving as their husbands march to glory. But the real letters tell another story. Wives rationing rice, mothers selling heirlooms, children asking when Papa will come home. Those questions never make it past the censors. The empire doesn't have room for doubt. You keep one letter tucked in your uniform's inner pocket. The paper is creased, nearly transparent from sweat, but the words are burned into your mind. It's from your sister, short and childish, ending with, "Come back and take me to the river again." Every time you think of surrender or despair, that sentence drags you back to yourself. It's the most powerful order you've ever received, though it carries no signature or seal. When soldiers die, their letters are collected and sent home, often rewritten by officers to sound noble. A dying man's delirious ramblings become patriotic last words. His real fears vanish under ink, replaced by carefully crafted sentences like, "I die smiling for the emperor." You've seen it happen. You've helped burn the originals. The smell of singed paper still lingers on your fingers. At night, when everyone else sleeps, you write in your head. You compose imaginary letters to people you'll never see again. Your childhood friend who joined the Navy, your teacher who said you'd make a fine writer. You narrate your days to them silently, the way a prisoner talks to ghosts. It's the only form of confession left. And perhaps that's the strangest truth. In a war obsessed with silence and obedience, the most subversive act isn't disobedience. It's remembering how to speak with love. You grip the pen tighter, draw one slow breath, and write again. I am healthy. My comrades are fine. Our spirits are strong. But this time, you know that somewhere between the lines, someone will hear what you really meant to say. You start noticing the sound of hunger before you feel it. The low, animal growl echoing through the barracks, rising in unison with the creak of boots and the clatter of tin bowls. Rations shrink, portions thin, and the cooks begin to serve hope more than food. The Imperial Army, they tell you, feeds on spirit. But spirit doesn't fill your stomach. The propaganda posters outside the mess hall still show smiling soldiers clutching bowls brimming with rice, sunlight glinting off their chopsticks like victory itself. Inside, reality is a gruel so watery you can see your reflection. Some days, you swear there's more air than rice. You joke that maybe the emperor himself eats air too. It's the only thing still abundant in Japan. The officers dine separately, of course. You can smell it. The real rice, the fish, the faint aroma of miso richer than gold. The lieutenant's meal tray shines like a mirror, carried behind paper screens as though the smell itself mustn't touch the common troops. You learn not to look, because envy is another kind of hunger. And here, that's the one appetite you're forbidden to show. To survive, you improvise. Some men trade cigarettes for a few extra grains of rice. Others learn to stretch flavor from almost nothing. Crushed soybeans, boiled weeds, even shoe polish for color. You chew slowly, tricking your body into thinking the meal lasts longer. A single grain of rice on your tongue feels like a treasure now. You laugh about it with the others, because humor is the last seasoning left. Someone says, if we keep marching, maybe we'll catch up to our next meal. Another answers, not unless it's marching away from us. Even the corporal chuckles, briefly, before barking, eat faster. You obey, of course. In the army, laughter has a curfew too. The officers love to quote an old slogan. The emperor's soldiers do not need to eat. They need to believe. Easy words when your belly's full. You begin to realize propaganda isn't designed to convince the enemy. It's designed to starve you gracefully. Every empty stomach becomes proof of loyalty. Every fainting soldier a small shrine to endurance. When you're assigned to kitchen duty, you glimpse the machinery behind the illusion. The rice barrels come half empty, the pickled vegetables moldy, the fish ration replaced by dried seaweed and excuses. You're told to make it look sufficient. You stir water until it becomes soup, salt air until it tastes like meat. It's culinary theater, one that keeps morale barely above starvation. But hunger changes men. Tempers grow short, laughter rarer. The smallest argument can turn into a scuffle. You catch yourself watching the cook's hands too closely as he measures rations, suspicion gnawing at your gut harder than hunger itself. The army preaches unity, but hunger breeds hierarchy. The ones near the food always end up higher. There's a moment that sticks with you. A recruit finds a dead rat behind the storage shed. He doesn't report it. He roasts it quietly, shares it with two others under the cover of night. You smell it and turn away, pretending not to notice. The next morning, they march with a strange calm in their eyes, like men who briefly remembered what satisfaction felt like. You envy them, even as you tell yourself you wouldn't do the same. Letters from home talk about rationing too. Your mother writes that even school children now eat millet instead of rice. We are proud to share the sacrifice, she says. You read that line 3 times, wondering if pride tastes any better when it's shared. The propaganda film shown one evening tries to keep spirits high. It's called The Road to Victory. You sit cross-legged with 100 others. watching projected images flicker across a white sheet. Actors in spotless uniforms. Soldiers marching through endless supplies. A smiling cook ladling steaming bowls of rice. The audience claps at the end, though half of them can barely stay upright. The irony is so thick it could feed everyone for a week. A few soldiers whisper about black markets, about villages that might still have food hidden away. But the penalty for theft is brutal, and the punishment public. The army doesn't just starve your body, it starves your imagination. You stop dreaming about food. You dream about not being hungry. When someone collapses during drills, the officer doesn't call for help. He shouts, "Endure!" And the rest keep marching. You tell yourself it's noble, but deep down, you know it's madness. Discipline doesn't fill empty stomachs. It just teaches you to pretend hunger is holy. And yet, within this deprivation, strange acts of grace still happen. A soldier slips you half his ration because you carried his pack yesterday. Another quietly refills your canteen when yours runs dry. No words exchanged, no thanks given, because kindness here isn't conversation. It's instinct, the last remnant of humanity the war hasn't eaten yet. One night, you sit outside the barracks under a cracked moon, chewing on a grain of roasted barley. You think about the meals you used to take for granted, the crunch of pickled radish, the warmth of tea, the sound of chopsticks clicking like music. Hunger sharpens memory. You can taste home more vividly now than you ever did when you were there. In the end, you realize the Army's true efficiency. It doesn't just teach you to obey. It teaches you to survive on nothing, to make endurance look like virtue, to smile, even when your ribs show through your skin. And as your stomach growls again, you can't help but think, somewhere, the Emperor must be sleeping soundly, dreaming of soldiers who never get hungry. Faith wears many faces. Sometimes it's a priest's robe, sometimes it's a helmet, and sometimes it's the trembling voice of a boy shouting prayers he doesn't understand. Every morning begins with ritual. Before sunrise, you and the others line up in the courtyard, breath fogging in the cold, waiting for the sergeant's command. The flag rises, the anthem hums, and you bow toward the Emperor's portrait. The act feels sacred, yet mechanical, like worship on a factory schedule. You've said Tenno Heika Banzai so many times the words have lost meaning, but still, they vibrate in your bones like muscle memory. Religion in the Imperial Army isn't about gods, it's about godhood. The Emperor is divine, or so you're told, and by extension, so is your suffering. You're not fighting for land or family, but for eternity. Even hunger becomes holy when framed as sacrifice. Somewhere in Tokyo, priests of the state Shinto faith recite blessings over the troops, calling you living spirits of Japan. You'd laugh if your mouth weren't so dry. Before drills, the chaplain, an older man with kind eyes and a weary posture, reads from a small booklet. It's the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, the sacred text of the military. The words are pure poetry and pure propaganda, telling you to be loyal, brave, and humble, to obey without hesitation, to die without fear. You've memorized every line, but it's the pauses that stick, the small moments where the chaplain's voice wavers, where even he seems unsure if belief and obedience are still the same thing. You've never been much of a religious man. Before the war, you visited shrines mostly for festivals, paper lanterns, sake, and laughter. But out here, belief becomes a survival tool. You start praying again, not for victory, but for small things, A dry day, a full stomach, one less beating. You bow, not because you're pious, but because it feels like doing something in a world where you control nothing. Some nights, during long guard shifts, you think about the stories priests told when you were a child. That a soldier who dies for the emperor becomes a kami, a spirit who watches over Japan. You look up at the stars and wonder how many of those twinkling lights are dead soldiers pretending to be constellations. You whisper to one of them, half in prayer, half in sarcasm. So, how's heaven? Do they have rice up there? Faith here isn't about comfort. It's about control. The army merges religion and nationalism until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Every ritual is designed to erase doubt. The rescript says, duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather. You repeat it daily, even when it starts to sound less like wisdom and more like a warning. But not everyone buys in. You meet a sergeant from Okinawa named Higa, who keeps a tiny Buddhist amulet hidden in his boot. My mother gave it to me, he says. It's not for the emperor. It's for me. You envy that honesty. In a system where the divine is monopolized by the state, a private prayer feels like rebellion. On Sundays, you sometimes march past local villagers being forced to bow toward the emperor's shrine. They look confused, frightened, obedient, the same way you did when you first arrived. It hits you that the entire empire runs on the same ritual, obedience disguised as reverence. Somewhere, far away, a school teacher tells children that soldiers like you are blessed, not broken. You'd almost believe it yourself if you weren't living the contradiction. The officers love speeches about kokutai, the national essence. They say Japan is one body and the emperor is its soul. The idea sounds noble until you realize what that makes you. A cell, replaceable, disposable. The body survives even if the cell dies. The metaphor works a little too well. Then there's the missionary presence. Before the war, Japan tolerated Christianity in small doses. But now, Christian chaplains must hide their crosses behind plain cloth. Yet you hear whispers that some officers secretly keep Bibles. One night, you see a captain reading by lamplight, mouthing something that isn't Japanese. He looks up, startled, and says, "Poetry." You nod, pretending to believe him. Maybe faith, in any language, has to hide here. Once, a squad mate named Yoshida carves a small wooden charm from a bamboo scrap. It's crude, uneven, but he ties it to his rifle strap anyway. For luck, he says. The corporal mocks him. Luck is for cowards. The next day, Yoshida's unit gets sent on a mission, and he doesn't return. That night, no one laughs. A few men carve charms of their own. Even the corporal keeps his voice low. You begin to see the strange duality of belief. It binds and blinds. It comforts you while keeping you compliant. You catch yourself bowing reflexively, even when no one's watching, even when the emperor's portrait is just a shadow on the wall. It's habit now, like breathing, like fear. But amid the dogma, something softer survives. When the chaplain whispers his closing prayer, "May your spirits be at peace," you feel a pang that's almost hope. Maybe he believes it. Maybe he doesn't. But in that moment, you want to. Because hope, even counterfeit, is still lighter than despair. One rainy morning, while polishing your rifle under a leaking roof, you pause and catch your reflection in the metal. You bow, not to the emperor, not to any god, but to the face staring back. For the first time, it feels like a real prayer. You're not asking for strength anymore. You're asking to remember who you are beneath the helmet. And maybe that's the quiet heresy no one talks about. That in a war where faith is mandatory, the most sacred act is daring to believe in yourself. You've traded the barracks for the jungle, and the air here feels alive enough to swallow you whole. It hums with insects, drips with humidity, and smells like rot and rain. You march through it until the world narrows to three sensations: heat, hunger, and noise. The textbooks back home called this tropical paradise. The soldiers call it the green hell. The Empire says you're liberating Asia. The locals you pass say nothing at all. Their faces are unreadable, eyes tracking your every step from behind palm fronds. Somewhere between Malaya and Burma, patriotism melts faster than sweat. You're not marching for glory anymore. You're marching because stopping means dying. The jungle doesn't care about ranks or flags. It eats officers and privates equally. Leeches slip through socks. Mosquitoes hum like distant engines, and every puddle hides a fever waiting for a host. Men whisper about invisible enemies: malaria, dysentery, dengue. The sergeant tells everyone to drink less water. It's for discipline. You drink anyway, because thirst feels more urgent than fear. Your rifle rusts faster than you can clean it. The humidity turns gunpowder to sludge. The maps you're given might as well be riddles. Half the time, you're not sure if you're advancing or wandering in circles. Command keeps saying the same words: forward, victory, emperor, as though repetition could replace direction. At first, the jungle seems endless but bearable. You even find its beauty in rare moments. Sunlight dripping through ferns, orchids glowing like lanterns, rivers glinting silver in the dusk. But beauty fades fast when your boots rot and your stomach twists from starvation. You start seeing the landscape less as scenery and more as a predator. You and your unit pass through abandoned villages, wooden huts half swallowed by vines, rice paddies shimmering like ghosts. Sometimes you find traces of life: a child's sandal, a cooking pot still warm, a chicken feather stuck in the mud. You tell yourself they left peacefully. You tell yourself a lot of things out here. The Imperial slogans still echo in your head, but they sound different now. Die beautifully, they said, but nothing about this is beautiful. The men who die here don't glow with heroism. They just vanish, swallowed by green silence. One day, you bury a comrade whose name you barely learned. No ceremony, no prayer. Just a shallow hole and the hope the ants will be kind. Malaria hits like divine punishment. It starts with chills, then fever, then madness. A soldier named Ito begins talking to trees, calling them mother. Another insists the Emperor has hidden a secret radio inside the moon. You want to laugh, but the sound sticks in your throat. Out here, madness feels logical. Officers grow thinner, angrier. They still bark orders with the same righteousness, but even their uniforms hang loose, their eyes hollow. You catch the captain rubbing a worn photo of his wife, murmuring apologies when he thinks no one can hear. For all their power, they're prisoners too, trapped in the myth they were paid to enforce. One evening, during a downpour, you stumble upon an Allied leaflet washed up against a rock. It's in Japanese, crudely printed, promising food and humane treatment if you surrender. You pass it around quietly, half joking. Humane treatment, someone scoffs. Probably means they'll feed us before they shoot us. but you tuck it in your pocket anyway, unsure if you're keeping it as a lifeline or a souvenir of your own doubt. The jungle teaches you new faith, the kind that doesn't need shrines or speeches. You pray to dry socks, to clean water, to waking up without fever. You measure time not in days, but in rations and blisters. The calendar in your head dissolves. Only survival remains. Sometimes, in the rare quiet between storms, you hear distant music. It's probably from a local village, but it sounds like ghosts playing flutes made of bone. The tune worms its way into your sleep, and you dream of home. Not the real one, but the idea of it, soft and unreachable, like sunlight underwater. The worst moments aren't the battles, they're the waiting. You dig foxholes, you mend boots, you chase rumors of reinforcements that never come. You learn to recognize the smell of death before you see it. You stop counting the bodies you bury because numbers don't make grief smaller. They just make it repetitive. One night, a soldier named Nakano confesses that he doesn't believe Japan will win. "We're ghosts already," he says. You tell him to shut up before someone hears. But later, lying awake under the mosquito net, you realize he's right. The Empire is too far away to hear you, too proud to admit you exist. Out here, soldiers aren't heroes. You're just lost mail from the homeland, letters the sender forgot to sign. The rain never stops. The jungle floor steams like a feverish body. Your uniform, once a symbol of honor, now clings to your